They placed the envelope on the table as if it were a consolation prize and not the last thing my father would ever hand me. My name is Marcus Hale. I am 48 years old, and for 20 years I was the man my father relied on to keep the household and the small family property running. I managed the bills, drove him to appointments, climbed the ladder when the shingles gave way, and sat up with him through the long watches when his breathing sounded like a boat in a slow harbor. Right now I was in a room that should have been ordinary and private and instead felt staged, every eye a camera waiting to catch my reaction. The room smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old paper. Light came in through the blinds in stripes that fell across the polished table where the envelope rested, plain and institutional, the kind of envelope that suggested business rather than condolence. I remembered the feel of my father's hand the day he signed the will, how his fingers trembled, but his grip had been steady enough to press the pen down in a way that made me think the signature belonged to a man who had made peace with small things. I had been the one to bring his kettle down in the morning, to fold the bath towel the way he liked, to adjust the thermostat when he complained that the house had stopped keeping summer out. Those were invisible labors until they were called into question by a sheet of paper and a stiff-lipped reading. Weekends in our house had been a ritual of simple abundance. Coffee that overbrewed, newspapers spread like sails, my father's voice low and satisfied as he argued the sports page into a truce with whatever passed for news. Neighbors drifted through with pies and stories, the back gate always open, small children chasing each other across the lawn until the light dwindled. I had no official title beyond son and caretaker, but that intimacy was currency to me. When he looked at me at 90 and said thank you for staying, the words landed like coins. They were payment for nights when I slept in the armchair by his bed, payment for canceled plans and gratitude swallowed so he could feel less alone. I thought of how often people had assumed our arrangement required little sacrifice. The truth was more granular. I learned to spot the slight wobble in a prescription bottle label, to detect when his appetite shifted enough to worry, to drive the long miles to a specialist because he hated hospitals but trusted my presence. I replaced the furnace filter in a snowstorm because he would not ask someone else to crawl under the eaves. I learned to read silence as if it were Morse code, to understand the small, stubborn signals that meant he wanted me to stay even when he could not say it plainly. Those repetitions shaped me into someone whose days were timed by another man's needs, whose small pleasures were measured against a ledger of care. Sitting there as the lawyer cleared his throat, those memories arrived like weather. I could feel the thread that had tied us taut, the obligations given and accepted, the quiet joys that only caregiving creates. The people around the table had faces I knew, some kind and some merely present, their expressions rehearsed into solemnity. But none of them had the daily residue of my life, that particular smell of coffee and old books embedded in my clothes, the map of his house memorized in my hands. I had been invisible in the way that is born of proximity. Present until absence reveals how much space you actually occupied. When the envelope was opened, sound seemed amplified. Paper scritched, the lawyer's glasses slid down his nose. The words in the document were supposed to be routine. Wills often read like that, a legal litany that concludes the living's business. Instead, there was a small disconnect, a pause that stretched like a seam that might tear. I felt something inside me go thin, as if a private chord had been picked and found out of tune. I had imagined this moment as quiet and final, a small gathering to note passage and move on, the house returning to its familiar creaks and comforts. That expectation mattered because my life had been woven into his in ways that could not fit on legal stationery. The meals, the calls, the nights on the couch with a thermometer and a hand to hold had been my way of staying near him, of honoring the man who taught me how to strip wallpaper and how to tie a knot properly. Those things were not just tasks, they were how I inhabited my world. To have the scene reduced to an envelope and signatures felt like watching an entire language of service vanish between two lines of type. The will reading should have been a small ceremony. It turned into the first time I felt truly erased. They told me there was a blood clause in the will, as if the words themselves could settle something that had never needed settling when my father was breathing. Male line descent, the lawyer said, like he was handing me a glossary term instead of a verdict. It sounded technical in his mouth, the way a diagnosis sounds technical to a relative who prefers to leave the gravity to the doctor. My cousins, the ones who waved from the end of a driveway at holidays and otherwise existed as names on a return address, leaned in with polite smiles that had teeth. They'd barely phoned while my father was alive. Now they had legal arguments neatly folded into their pleasantries. The executor opened a manila folder and passed me photocopies as if those sheets could explain my life. There were pages from the family tree, a typed recitation of the clause, and a list of demands printed in a font that felt like a judge's bench. Certified birth certificates proving direct male line descent, marriage records tracing paternal names across 3 generations, notarized affidavits affirming paternity signed before witnesses, and a deadline that left me no more than a few days in which the estate could be partitioned, and my access to the house and accounts closed. The list required my father's cooperation in ways that made the room go thin at the edges. He was the only person who could have corroborated certain things. He was gone. "How am I supposed to get that?" I asked, because it had to be asked aloud. The question hung there, naive and obvious. "You'll need to produce the documents or submit to testing," the executor replied, a little too patiently. He slid an extra sheet across the table, a flowchart of procedures and potential fees, the sort of thing meant to reassure people that law could make the mess tidy. Instead, it felt like a map that omitted the bridge I stood on. That afternoon, ordinary gestures in town began to change tone. People who used to knock on the door and ask if I could spare a ride now crossed the street. Mrs. Pennington, who had rooted me out for handyman favors and jars of jam for years, glanced at my hands as if they might be stained by culpability and pretended not to see me wave. Children I taught how to hold a wrench avoided my eye as their mothers tugged them along, mouths pursed like they were swallowing something bitter. The family room I had sat in for decades, the one with the threadbare armchair and the shelf of paperbacks my father loved, felt different the next time I walked in. Conversations receded, laughter cut off mid-sentence. It was as though the room had been instructed to forget I was part of its furniture. Whispers followed me after I left. They aren't loud at first. Gossip is a weather pattern that starts as a haze. I would catch the curl of a sentence as I passed a gate, some careful variation on "there's more to it," or a staccato, nervous laugh from a street I used to walk down with the mail. One cousin Thomas, who had once borrowed a ladder and returned it dented and profuse with apologies, stopped me on the sidewalk to tell me, smiling, how neatly the will had been drawn to keep property in a direct line. His laughter had no malice in it, only the kind of conviction that comes when you think the law is a mirror reflecting only the facts you want to see. It landed like salt, my phone filled with calls I didn't take. Each unanswered ring felt like a small stone in a pocket. I tried to get straight answers from the mortgage company, expecting the sort of procedural boredom I'd handled when I refinanced years ago. Instead, the woman at the other end spoke in phrases that made my stomach twist. Title dispute, probate hold, awaiting documentation. The mortgage department put everything on ice until the dispute resolved. The bank's caution felt bureaucratic and final, like a hand closing on the doorknob of a place I'd thought was mine by habit if not by paperwork. Shame settled in my chest as if it were physical. A thickness behind my sternum, a heaviness in my shoulders. It altered how I moved through the world. Where my father's things had been a kind of proof, his cardigan on the back of a chair, the dent in the armrest where he liked to lean, now those objects were evidence for other people to parse. The idea that I could be unmade by signature and clause shocked me more than anger did. Confusion crept in. How could the man I fed and cared for, who thanked me for staying, have written a stipulation that cut the living cord between us so neatly? Isolation found its home there, in small domestic spaces that had previously been crowded with commotion. I began to notice the silences like a new bitter taste. At family gatherings, my presence created a new choreography. People shifted chairs to make space, then shifted backs, as if my seat itself had become suspect. Even those who offered condolences spoke in phrases that kept distance. They were generous with formality and miserly with warmth. I felt watched by a kind of legal gaze, now the executor's list like a ledger balanced against my life, and everything I had done for 20 years was suddenly subject to verification or dismissal. At night the house was too loud. Every creak felt like a creak of accusation. I wandered from room to room looking for some physical proof that I belonged there beyond the memory of a shared kettle or an empty chair. The envelope that had been passed across the table felt heavier in my pocket than it had on the surface of the lawyer's desk. It was a talisman of exclusion. They had managed, with a clause and a photocopy, to turn familiarity into question. I slept badly, not from grief alone, but from the sharp, dull ache of being treated like a variable to be calculated rather than the son I had been. The call came the afternoon the sky had the lazy gray of a neighborhood that never quite commits to rain. It was Thomas's voice, bright as if he were telling me about a sale, and then that laugh, the sort of light, clean chuckle people use when they want to show how clever they are without sounding mean. "They did it right, Marcus," he said. "Everything stayed in the line. Isn't that tidy?" He said tidy like it was a compliment. The laugh kept going, like a metronome. In the background I could hear someone else's voice, low and conspiratorial, and for a second I felt like I was overhearing a private joke. That laugh was a cut that went both ways. It hurt, and it clarified. I sat on the back steps with the receiver pressed to my ear until the call ended and the porch went back to its usual sounds, the dryer humming 2 houses over, Mrs. Pennington's dog barking at a mail truck that had long since passed. I remember thinking with a kind of cold lucidity that I had 2 choices. One was to accept that names on a piece of paper could dissolve 20 years of mournings and care. The other was to make the only thing these people respected speak louder than the stories they were telling. Proof. Proof, I realized, had a particular grammar. My father's memory and my own testimony were suddenly rhetorical. Sworn affidavits were handier to them than the worn scarf he always wore. Where words failed me, maybe molecules wouldn't. I started thinking about the body as a ledger you couldn't forge, genetic facts that traveled down male lines like a stubborn current. I had never before imagined my identity as something that could be affirmed in a lab, as if the man I was could be condensed into a chart of markers. But what my cousins had wrought with the stroke of a pen felt like an erasure. If the world now moved by documentation, then I would gather documentation until it could not be ignored. That night I read until the kitchen light buzzed and complained. I pulled up forums, scientific articles, and the dry-sounding pages of labs that offered Y-DNA tests. There were acronyms and words that made my head swim: haplogroups, SDRs, SNPs, but underneath the jargon there was a simple mechanic. Y chromosome DNA passes almost unchanged from father to son. It was the sort of stubborn inheritance clause of biology that a lawyer's font couldn't edit. Articles cautioned about privacy, about the family secrets. DNA could reveal the unexpected siblings, the misattributed paternity, the kind of quiet ruptures you don't advertise in condolence cards. Those warnings registered. The idea of opening a window into the private architecture of our family made me uneasy in a way I didn't expect. Part of me had spent my life keeping certain things tidy and contained because my father didn't want them aired. I remember feeling both ashamed and oddly thrilled by that discomfort. There was a childish side, thin and defiant, that loved the image of sticking a lab report in someone's smug face and saying, "Read that." There was also the adult, exhausted part of me that recognized the cost. This wasn't just facts and figures. If I traced paternal lines, I might expose infidelities, adoptions kept quiet, cousins who weren't as close as they claimed. I might pull at a thread that unraveled whole histories people had arranged to their convenience. I thought of my father's voice, of him thanking me for staying, and I didn't want to drag him through gossip. But he was gone, and the people who suddenly cared about lineage hadn't been there to steady him when his breath thinned. The scales tipped, the work ahead looked technical, and I liked that. For 2 decades I had fixed what needed fixing: roofs, schedules, calls to doctors. Here was another repair job, close enough to the tools I used to handle. I would read, learn, hire the right people. I started making lists with the same practical steadiness I applied to grocery runs and contractor calls. Labs that offered accredited testing, genealogists who specialized in male line tracing, attorneys who would accept the kind of evidence a bench would respect. I scribbled names, phone numbers, and fees on the back of a receipt, the way I used to keep track of spare parts. Calling the first professional felt like climbing over my own dignity. I left a message for a genetic genealogist recommended in a forum by someone who sounded as anxious as I felt. I kept my voice level when I spoke later, explaining that I needed to establish paternal descent for legal purposes and that discretion mattered. He listened, then asked questions that were suddenly practical instead of moral. Where were the birth records? Did I have any living male line relatives to test? Had the estate been contested? When he said he could help, his tone was quiet and precise, like a mechanic telling you he could fix the engine if you were willing to pay for parts. Paying for parts felt like admitting defeat and taking responsibility at once. I transferred a sum on my banking app that made my breath hitch, not just a financial hit but a symbolic one, a line in the ledger where hope met expense. It was the most adult thing I'd done in a long time and the most childish. investing in a kind of proof that would make the people who'd laughed think twice. I thought of the potential exposure again and felt the small churn of fear. If secrets spilled, it would not be me who chose the pages of the past. But the idea of letting the law so eager to read lineage have the final word on my life felt worse. By the time I hung up, a steady resolve had settled into me. I would let science do the talking. If the truth was buried under polite silences and legalese, I would dig it up with the most incontrovertible tool I could find. I folded my hands and, for the first time since the will reading, felt like I had a plan that belonged to me and not to the people who decided how my life should be measured. The decision felt desperate and righteous at once, like lighting a match in a quiet room to see what, if anything, answered back. I kept my mouth shut more carefully than I ever had around my father. Silence felt like armor. I let them think I had folded, that the loss had flattened me into an easy story they could tuck away. The work I did in private required a different kind of stubbornness, the slow, repetitive patience of a machine shop. Each piece of evidence was a small part, and they needed to fit together with no slack. First, I ordered a test from an accredited lab that specialized in legal-grade Y-DNA analysis. It was not the sort of kit people used when they were curious about distant cousins. This was the version with a chain of custody protocol and a notary stamp. I drove to a clinic, handed over a sealed envelope to a nurse, watched him fill out the paperwork, and felt ridiculous and righteous at once as the swab went into a biohazard bag, and then into another bag, and then into a courier envelope. There is a strange dignity to watching a human act on your behalf to make your claim plausible. The lab confirmed receipt, then told me the timetable. Waiting for those results became a new kind of anxiety. I hired a genetic genealogist the same week. His emails were crisp, the kind of emails that do not apologize for clarity. He asked for names, birthplaces, any known male relatives, and what my father had told me about his grandfather. He wanted the smallest things I had always taken for granted: where my family had lived, who married whom, a baptismal record my grandmother kept in a shoebox. I found those papers and scanned them carefully. The genealogist drew tentative lines on a simple chart and told me where we could look for corroboration. He spoke of SDR markers and haplotypes with the clinical affection of someone describing a map. Mapping the trees took longer than the testing. People forget that genealogy is less about high drama and more about legible handwriting. I spent nights transcribing records from microfilm copies, confirming dates on census entries, and photocopying marriage licenses that smelled faintly of mildew. There were dead ends, and suddenly a census spelled a surname slightly wrong and a baptismal register missed a child by a year. Each correction felt like a small victory. The genealogist matched my Y-DNA sample to existing public profiles that shared close markers and then contacted holders of those profiles. Some never replied. Others agreed to test further, skeptical at first and then practical when they understood the stakes. I reached out quietly to a cousin I had barely known. Her name was Lena, and she had always kept to herself at family gatherings. I remembered her eyes watching me when my father's breaths were thin, the way she did not join the louder conversations. She distrusted the version of family history that favored certain lines and left gaps where people should have been. I sent her a careful message, explained who I was and why I needed help, and offered to arrange testing on terms she trusted. She agreed to meet at a diner 2 towns over where the coffee was indifferent and the booths were high. Lena had a pocketbook of records I had never seen. She handed over letters, a faded funeral card, even a notation in the margin of a vintage photograph identifying men by their nicknames. Her doubts came in soft sentences. She told me about whispers that had clung to a relative like dust and about a conversation she had overheard where the executor had seemed too eager. We compared notes. Her Y-DNA test confirmed what the genealogist suspected, a match at several SDR markers with my sample. The markers lined up in a way that suggested direct paternal descent. There was a relief that came from having an ally I had not known I needed. Everything else was logistics and a kind of legal hygiene. I paid for the chain of custody certification so no one could claim the sample had been swapped or submitted by a hobbyist. I had documents notarized, receipts tracked, and a sworn affidavit from the nurse who collected my sample. The genealogist drafted a report that explained the matches in plain language and included the statistical likelihoods and the limits of inference. He was meticulous about what the testing could and could not say. If there were explanations that undermined our claim, he told me to expect them. we prepared responses. The more technical the materials became, the more human the work felt. I found myself in libraries, in county clerks' offices, and on the phone with distant relatives who remembered a name or a place. One elderly cousin mailed me a ledger with careful handwriting. Another sent a copy of a ship manifest showing a family arrival date that corroborated an oral story my father had repeated. It was odd to realize how much of our lives had been preserved in such mundane places. I kept thinking of my father stacking bills and greeting cards on the kitchen counter, and how those little piles were now part of an argument about identity. Public life required a different performance. I continued to show up at the barbecues, to laugh in the right places, to comment on the weather and ask after someone's knee surgery. They watched me, some of them with a watchful contempt, others with the embarrassed curiosity of people who do not like taking sides. I let their assumptions stand. I was careful with my face, practiced a neutral warmth, and never let impatience show. Inside, I was piling up facts, each one sterile on its own, but together forming a structure I trusted more than any conversation ever could. I felt guilty at times, as if I were betraying my father by turning private threads into paperwork. Yet there was comfort in the objectivity of the reports and the clean language of the lab. No one could very well explain away a certified chain of custody or a matching Y-DNA marker without contorting into implausibility. While they nursed their quiet confidence, the evidence assembled itself quietly, patiently, into something that would not sway with gossip or social advantage. Behind that practiced smile, the evidence was assembling itself into a quiet, immovable thing. I walked into the conference room with the packet in my briefcase and a calm I had to borrow from the long patience of the last months. The table was polished to the kind of shine that makes everyone conscious of their hands and their posture. The executor sat at one end with a legal pad, a phone face down beside him. My cousins arranged themselves like jurors, as if a show of numbers could make a story truer. I set my briefcase down, unlatched it, and took out the folder in a single movement I had practiced in my head. Papers do not shout. They land. I slid the folder across the table to the executor and watched his fingers close around the top sheet. It was a cover letter from my lawyer, addressed to him, to the cousins, and to the probate office. Underneath, arranged with deliberate neatness, were photocopies of the chain of custody forms, the nurse's affidavit, the courier manifest showing seal numbers, and finally the laboratory certificate with its stamps and accession number. There was the genealogist's report as well, printed in clear type with a chart that showed the Y-DNA markers aligning in a clean vertical line from the ancestral male named in the will down to my sample. All the talk and the laughter washed out of the room with a small sound like fabric sliding off wood. I had not expected theatrics. I had expected to be met with logic, or at worst with denial that required more argument. What I did not expect was the immediate chemical quiet that fills a room when an unsustainable story is held up to light. The executor skimmed the lab certificate like someone flipping through a menu, then stopped. He looked up at me, and I could see him counting options. The cousins made an involuntary noise, half question and half scoff. That was the moment I felt something in me change from the private accumulation of facts into a public thing with teeth. Lena sat beside me, hands folded, her face neutral. I had asked her to come. I needed an ally who did not look like a hired advocate and who had been quietly skeptical of what had been presented as family truth. One cousin reached for his phone as if to call a lawyer. Another rifled through the affidavits they had prepared, muttering about dates and witnesses. The genealogist had anticipated those moves. The report addressed the statistical likelihoods, explained what SDR marker matches mean, and spelled out the limits of interpretation. It also pointed out discrepancies in the affidavits they had submitted, where dates overlapped impossibly and signatures looked similar to one another in awkward ways. I had included copies of the original documents those affidavits contradicted. Paperwork can be blunt and devastating. A paralegal from my lawyer's office watched from the doorway, phone in hand, ready to confirm the lab's accreditation. The executor's expression shifted when he saw that call made. He answered in a voice that tried for composure but sounded small. He put the phone on speaker. There was a brief verification from the lab, the sort of procedural confirmation that normally returns without drama. The voice explained the chain of custody stamps, the accession number, the notary on the collector's form. The cousins listened as if they were hearing a language that proved to be true in some permanent way. One of them pushed back with the old idea of family stories, of non-paternal events and human complexity. He tried to conjure scenarios where the lab could be wrong. The genealogist countered calmly, pointing to the specificity of Y-DNA patterns and to the control measures the lab had published. He reminded the room that the test was not a hobbyist result with a barcode sticker, but a documented legal sample collected and verified by a medical professional. You could argue mistakes and accidents, he said, but you needed more than speculation to overcome a documented chain of custody and a statistically significant direct match. I watched color leave faces one by one. Where there had been confident lines and practiced indignation, small fissures opened. I had imagined the theatrical moments, the gavel of argument, the raised voices. Instead, the unraveling looked like someone unbuttoning a shirt too many buttons at once. Consistency dissolved under the steady drip of facts. The forged affidavits I had suspected were suddenly obvious when compared to contemporaneous records and to the signatures in other documents. There was no room left for the trim narratives they'd built. The executor shifted his seat and read the room as a professional does when a plan collapses. He had been friendly to some of the cousins, had benefited from their confidence. Now he had a duty to the court and to the estate, and the court accepted authenticated lab results. A quiet conversation began between him and his counsel. They were careful, the way people are when they have been placed in a position where pragmatism must replace partiality. He asked questions about the preferred path forward and about how contested claims might be resolved with minimum disruption. That was the sound of power rebalancing. I did not feel triumphant. I felt something closer to a return. Restitution is an odd sensation. It tastes faintly metallic, like an old coin finally put back where it belongs. Once the papers had been circulated further to the probate office and to the cousins' attorneys, the room lost much of its edge. People gathered their things, there were a few low arguments about process, and one cousin stormed out with a hand over his mouth as if the air itself had betrayed him. Lena squeezed my hand once, a quick, steady pressure that said more than words. As the door closed behind the last of them, I sat for a moment with the quiet. The packet of papers had done what I had hoped and feared it might do. It had cut through gossip and privilege with blunt documentation. I had not wanted revenge for its own sake. I had wanted a correction. In that polished room, with the evidence laid out and legally verified, the correction had arrived. It was not the end of family or of the hurt, but it was the moment when what was mine by right was acknowledged, and when the version of history that had tried to erase me was proven insufficient. The restitution felt like the settling of dust after a storm, not an exultant trumpet. The paperwork cleared the probate office within a month. The house was transferred by a clerk who wore a look that tried to be deferential and ended up neutral. I signed my name until my wrist ached, each stroke a motion that felt both ordinary and monumental. The money arrived in an account with a number that meant nothing at first and then everything. I kept my father's watch on my wrist for a day straight, feeling its weight the way I had when I was young and he would catch me sneaking into his office. That small circle of metal was the kind of heirloom that carries a man's rhythm with it. It kept me anchored in ways the ledger could not. People asked whether I felt vindicated, as if the account balance was the final measure of justice. I told them what I had felt, which was a slow uncoiling more than a shout. I recovered what the will had promised, but the money was only a ledger entry. The true cost was the quiet absences at family gatherings, the way certain holidays now arrived with seats empty at the table. Some relatives never spoke to me again. Their silence became a presence as solid as any person I had known. Others wrote letters of apology that read like drafts, sentences hedged with qualifiers, and a carefulness that revealed how little they wanted to risk their new, smaller positions inside the family. A few of those apologies felt sincere, more felt like legal documents in language that had learned to bend without breaking. I thought at first I would keep everything, let the estate be an affirmation of my care, my years at my father's elbow. Instead, I gave half of the settlement away. Part of it went to the community charities my father had supported, the small organizations that fed old men in winter and taught kids how to throw a baseball. Part of it went to the nurses and the aides who had come in for late shifts and who had stayed when I could not, when work or exhaustion left holes I could not fill. They had been my father's hands when mine were elsewhere. Paying them was not only repayment, it was the only way I could imagine carrying forward his priorities without letting the estate become a monument to the battles it had required. Giving money away felt like a repudiation of the bartering that had cost me so much. It was also a way to keep my father's name tied to things that had always mattered to him. I kept the house because of the way light moves across that old kitchen table in the afternoon, because of the squeak on the third stair that his hip had made him avoid when he was young and stubborn. I kept the watch because it fit my wrist and because it ticked with a patience I needed. The house is small work for a man who had nearly been erased from a family record, but it is home. It is the place where my father's scatter of tools still sits in the shed, where his mug remains in the cupboard if I want it to, and where I can, at odd hours, read the letters he kept folded in a drawer. The unraveling taught me something I had suspected but not admitted. Blood can be measured with instruments, with charts and verification. Family is something else. Family is formed by returning phone calls, by showing up on bad days, by the accumulation of small, unremarkable commitments. Those are never written into clauses. When people choose convenience or advantage over connection, the facade of kinship falls away fast and hard. The betrayal that came from some of them was not shocking in its existence. It was painful in its proximity. The people who had called themselves cousins chose a story that benefited them, and that choice exposed how thin their ties were. I also learned to trust evidence over whispers, but I learned a different lesson that surprised me. Evidence is precise and necessary, but it is not always the tool for healing. The science I used to reclaim what was mine could not fix the lingering awkwardness at church potlucks or the stilted small talk with neighbors who had watched the drama unfold. There are wounds that documents do not touch, so I worked on other fronts. I repaired friendships the way I had once fixed a leaky roof, by showing up with tools and patience. I cultivated a new circle of people who proved their loyalty not by lineage but by acts. Lena remained a friend in a way that did not need speeches. The genealogist became a sort of surprising companion over coffee on one occasion, someone whose work had become part of my life and whose manner was strangely steadying. I let those ties build slowly so they would not break easily. There is a particular silence that settled after the storm. It is not empty. It is a hush that allows me to read without overhearing half-truths. It lets the house keep its own noises, the creak of the floor and the fridge's faint hum. I prefer it to the whispers that once trailed me down the street. Those whispers were always hungry for story and always quick to decide. The silence is kinder. It leaves room for me to be the kind of son my father knew me as, not the stripped-down version that paperwork tried to create. At night I wind the watch and think about time in a way I did not before. Time is not only what was lost and what was regained. It is the slow accumulation of choices, of who answers your call and who hangs up. I have fewer relatives around my table now. I have more consistency in the people who do come. That trade-off is its own kind of settlement. In the end, I kept what mattered most in practical and in sentimental ways. The rest dissolved into a lesson I could not unlearn, one that will guide how I choose company for the years ahead.